It was supposed to be a quiet family getaway. David and Sarah Miller and their two sons, 14-year-old Ryan and 10-year-old Ethan, had come to Clearwater Lake for their annual fishing trip. Every year the same cabin. The same calm water. The same promise of peace away from the noise of the city. That morning the lake glimmered under a soft gray sky. David was untangling fishing lines, Sarah prepared sandwiches, and the boys were already arguing over who'd catch the biggest fish. Just a normal day. Just a normal family. Ethan was the quiet one, shy, thoughtful, always wandering a little ahead of everyone else. As the afternoon light dimmed, he picked up his rod and told his parents he was going to find the perfect spot to fish. He disappeared down the trail that curved around the edge of the lake, and that was the last time anyone saw him. Sound, distant thunder roll. A few minutes later, the first drops of rain began to fall. Sarah called his name. What? Twice. No answer. David started walking the shoreline, calling louder now, his voice echoing through the trees. Ryan jogged down the path toward the dock, scanning the water. The clouds thickened. The wind picked up. What had been a calm afternoon turned into a wall of rain and darkness. Sound, thunderclap, wind intensifies. By evening, panic had taken over. The family searched through mud and brush, shouting until their voices broke. When night fell, the forest swallowed their cries. Sound, flashlight clicks, distant police radio chatter. By midnight, the local RCMP arrived. Officers moved through the woods with flashlights, calling Ethan's name. Search dogs, volunteers, boats, the entire area combed through until dawn. But when the sun rose over Clearwater Lake, all they found was Ethan's fishing rod. It was leaning neatly against a rock by the water's edge. No footprints. No signs of struggle. No trace of where he went. Sound, faint water drip, eerie silence. Over the next few days the search widened. Helicopters circled overhead. Divers went into the lake. Nothing. And as quickly as the search began, it ended. The official story, no evidence of foul play. Likely lost to the storm. But the people who live around Clearwater Lake still talk about that night. They say the woods go silent when the wind shifts. They say sometimes, just before the rain begins, you can still hear a boy's voice calling from across the water. 3 days had passed since 10-year-old Ethan Miller vanished without a trace. The search around Clearwater Lake had grown desperate. Police cruisers lined the dirt road leading to the family's rented cabin. Volunteers arrived from neighboring towns. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police brought in tracking dogs, divers, and even aerial teams. But as the hours stretched into days, hope began to fade. The lake gave nothing back. The forest stood silent. Sound, police radios crackle faintly, fading into background. David and Sarah Miller remained at the cabin, sleepless, hollow-eyed, waiting for news that never came. Ryan, their 14-year-old son, barely spoke. He sat on the porch most days, staring toward the tree line where his brother had disappeared. The RCMP had one working theory: Ethan had wandered too far, disoriented by the storm, and drowned. But divers searched for 4 straight days. The sonar scans came up empty. That's when whispers began to spread. Locals told stories, not to the press but to each other, about Clearwater's dark history. About people who had vanished in those woods before. About the sound of voices echoing across the lake long after sunset. Soft wind rises, faint water ripples sound. The RCMP's lead investigator, Sergeant Helen Carver, wasn't one for superstition. She'd seen enough tragedies to know people looked for meaning when there was none. But there was something about this case that didn't fit. On the 5th morning, a volunteer discovered something strange. Half a kilometer from where Ethan's fishing rod had been found, down a narrow animal trail, there was a small clearing. And in the center of that clearing, a circle of stones. Inside the circle, a child's footprint. Perfectly preserved in the mud. Pause, faint heartbeat sound or low thud. The print matched Ethan's shoe size exactly. But what unsettled everyone wasn't where it was found. It was how. The area around it was untouched. No other footprints leading in or out. No drag marks. No signs of disturbance. Just one perfect footprint in the middle of the clearing, as if the boy had stepped there, and vanished. Sound, wind gust, faint whispering of trees. When David saw the photograph of the footprint, he broke down. He insisted Ethan must still be alive. Sarah refused to look. But Sergeant Carver ordered the area secured. Forensics swept the site, collecting soil samples and photographing every angle. They found something else too, buried just beneath the surface of the mud. A piece of fabric torn roughly in half. Blue and yellow, patterned with small fish. It matched the shirt Ethan had been wearing that day. Scene shift, night ambience, insects, faint rustle of branches. That night, heavy fog rolled in over the lake. Volunteers gathered around campfires, whispering about the search. Some said they'd heard voices echoing through the fog. A child's laughter, faint but unmistakable, carried across the water. Most brushed it off as imagination or the wind. But one of the searchers, an older man named Grant Havelock who'd lived in Clearwater all his life, said he'd heard that same sound before. Back in '97, he told the officers quietly, a boy from Meadow Creek went missing. Never found him. Same lake. Same kind of storm. When asked why it wasn't in any report, Grant only shrugged. Because around here, he said, people stop asking questions once the woods take something. By day 6, the official search began winding down. The RCMP were out of leads. The forest was too vast, too unpredictable. But Sergeant Carver couldn't shake the feeling that something was being missed. She spent one last evening at the site where the fishing rod had been found, standing alone by the water's edge. The surface was still now, glassy and black beneath the fading light. As she turned to leave, her flashlight beam caught something glinting beneath the shallow water. She crouched down, reached in and pulled it free. A small metal object. Cold and dull. It was a compass. On the back, scratched faintly into the metal, were the initials EM. Sound, water drip, slow, rhythmic. It wasn't listed among Ethan's belongings. The family didn't recognize it. And when the lab examined it the next morning, they discovered something even stranger. The compass needle didn't point north. It spun slowly, then stopped, pointing toward the forest. Every time they tried to reorient it, it turned back to the same direction. Scene shift, morning, distant loon call, quiet waves. Meanwhile, rumors spread faster than the investigation. Locals said Clearwater Lake had always been cursed. That the land beneath it used to belong to a logging company that burned down in the 1930s, killing dozens of workers. The story went that the company built over old burial grounds, and ever since people had gone missing. Of course, none of it was written in any official record. But if you asked the older residents, they'd tell you about the lights. Pale white orbs that sometimes appeared deep in the trees after dark. Always around the same time, just before a storm. David Miller didn't believe in ghosts. But the night after the search ended, he went back into the woods alone. He couldn't sit still anymore. He couldn't leave without finding his son. He walked for hours, calling Ethan's name through the darkness. Then he saw something, a faint light between the trees. Not a flashlight. Not a reflection. Just a dim, floating glow. He followed it. Sound, soft heartbeat, distant whisper of wind, echo of water. The deeper he went, the quieter everything became. No insects, no wind, just silence. Then, somewhere ahead, he heard it. A voice. Small. Fragile. Familiar. Dad. David froze. His throat closed. Ethan? No answer. He took another step and the light blinked out. In the silence that followed, he realized the ground beneath him felt soft, spongy, uneven. He looked down. He was standing inside the same stone circle where they'd found the footprint. Sound, thunder builds in distance. When Sarah found him the next morning, David was sitting by the water's edge, soaked, trembling, staring into the lake. He said nothing. When she asked what happened, he whispered only one thing. He's still out there. After that night, David refused to speak to the RCMP. He packed their things, took Sarah and Ryan home and tried to move on. But something had changed in him. He stopped working. He stopped sleeping. At night, he'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced he heard Ethan's voice outside the window. Ryan said his father had started drawing rough sketches of trees, stones, and strange symbols. Always the same pattern. Always the same circle. Weeks turned into months. Then one morning, Sergeant Carver received a call from the RCMP detachment in Meadow Creek, the same town Grant had mentioned. A hiker had found something in the woods about 20 kilometers north of Clearwater. An old shack half buried in vines. Inside on the floor they found children's belongings, a small shoe, a faded photograph, a toy car. And on the wall, scratched deep into the wood, were the words, "It comes when the storm does." Forensic teams dated the items, some over 30 years old. But one item stood out. A single page from a missing persons report. Ethan Miller's report. The paper was torn, weathered, but the name was clear, and the ink was fresh. No one could explain how it got there. No one could explain why the ink hadn't faded. But locals said that the next night, the weather changed again. Clouds rolled in. The lake went still. And just before the storm hit, someone saw a light moving through the trees. Small. flickering, like a lantern. Some swore they heard a child's voice calling softly over the wind. Ethan Miller has never been found. The RCMP closed the case the following spring. But every summer, when the storms return to Clearwater Lake, the locals say the air changes, heavy and electric. And if you stand by the water at dusk, you might hear it too. A faint splash. A whisper. A voice calling from beneath the pines. The ice had only just melted when the first visitor returned to Clearwater Lake. 6 months had passed since Ethan Miller vanished. The search was long over. The tourists were gone. Only the forest remained, silent as though holding its breath. But Sergeant Helen Carver couldn't stay away. Some cases fade. Others rot. This one never left her. She'd driven 5 hours north from her detachment, back to the same cabin-lined shore where everything began. The RCMP had archived the case as a weather-related disappearance, but Carver's instincts wouldn't let it rest. The air was sharp that morning. Frost still clung to the edges of the trees. The lake looked calm, too calm, its surface reflecting the pale sun like a mirror. The place felt empty but not abandoned. It felt waiting. Carver parked near the Miller family's old cabin. The door was padlocked now, the windows covered in dust. A for sale sign hung crooked near the porch. She stood there for a long time, remembering the night of the storm, the chaos, the floodlights, the sound of Ryan's voice cracking as he screamed for his brother. She still saw the boy's face sometimes when she closed her eyes. Carver took a slow breath and walked toward the water. The spot where the fishing rod had been found looked different in the spring light. Smaller, quieter, harmless. But beneath the surface, she could still imagine that compass spinning in the dark. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a plastic evidence bag. Inside the compass, it still didn't work. The needle spun slowly, then stopped, pointing toward the treeline just as it had before. Carver stared at it for a moment, then whispered under her breath, "Show me." The wind shifted. Sound, faint rustle of leaves, low drone builds. Something in the distance caught her eye, movement just beyond the treeline. A figure maybe. But when she blinked, it was gone. She spent the morning reviewing old files spread across the hood of her truck. Photographs, reports, search maps. Everything pointed back to the same location, that clearing with the stone circle. When she'd last seen it, it was sealed off, marked with yellow tape. But now the tape was gone. She followed the trail carefully, mud squelching under her boots. The forest had changed, new growth, fallen branches, but the air carried the same heavy stillness she remembered. When she reached the clearing, her stomach tightened. The stones were still there. But the circle was no longer empty. At its center, the ground was disturbed, shallow earth turned over recently. Someone had been here. Carver crouched down. Her gloved hand brushed against something hard, metal. She dug gently, uncovering an old cassette recorder half buried in the soil. The casing was cracked, weather-beaten, but the tape inside was intact. Later that night, back at her small motel room in town, Carver borrowed an old player from the front desk clerk. She placed the cassette inside, pressed play, and waited. At first, nothing but static. Then faintly, a voice. It was Sarah Miller. "It's been 2 weeks and they still won't tell us what they found. They keep saying it's nothing, but I know what I heard. I know what I saw." Her voice trembled. "The lights came back last night. I saw them from the porch. And I swear I heard him. Ethan. He was calling my name." There was a pause, then a faint scratching sound followed by another voice in the distance. A whisper. "Help." Then silence. Carver played it back 3 times. The voice, the child's voice, was faint but real. The timestamp on the tape suggested it had been recorded 2 weeks after the official search ended. But Sarah had never mentioned it in any interview. And the family had left Clearwater by then. So how did the tape end up buried in that clearing? Carver reached out to David Miller. It took 3 days before he agreed to meet. They sat together in a small diner on the outskirts of town. David looked older now, pale, drawn, his hands trembling as he stirred his coffee. When she told him about the cassette, he froze. "I didn't know she recorded anything," he said quietly. "After we left Sarah, she wasn't the same. She said she could hear Ethan at night, out by the trees. I thought it was grief. We both started seeing things that weren't there." "What kind of things?" Carver asked. He hesitated. "Lights. In the woods. Every time it rained." Sarah had died the following winter. Carver remembered the report, a car accident on the Trans-Canada. David had survived. Ryan hadn't been with them.